This is a very special occasion. It's the first full-scale retrospective of Paula Rego in the country. It feels really momentous because the work resonates so much with our time. It's a wonderful opportunity to look back at 60 years of work, of incredible, constant reinvention, and to do so in the city that Paula has called home for most of her life.
The Tate exhibition is hugely important for Paula. For many years, she was seen as the fairy tale artist, painting nursery rhymes and fairy tales, when the reality was that she was always at the hard, tough, political end of art. And so in this exhibition, you get to see her themes, all her themes, not just the pretty ones, but the ones that really have made a difference in the world, to her and to us, actually.
Paula Rego was born in Lisbon, in Portugal, in 1935. She grew up in a liberal, anti-fascist family, and her parents always supported her aspiration to become an artist. To me, it was very important to situate the beginning of the exhibition in the experience of the Portuguese dictatorship and Paula's childhood in Portugal. There was no freedom of expression, there was no political freedom. Women had very few possibilities. I believe that experience forged Paula's approach to her thinking and art making. The first room began with interrogation, a painting from 1950 when Paula was only 15 years old. That to us was an extraordinarily important picture. It's a scene of an interrogation, of a moment of torture. And it is just such an extraordinary image that someone of 15 years of age could imagine, something that was so invisible, and that drive to address the abuse and make it visible. It is a remarkable picture that I believe very much set the tone for the entire exhibition. To Paula's parents, it was clear that Portugal was not the right context for a young woman to grow up. And they very much wanted Paula to be able to live in a liberal country with freedom of expression and better possibilities for a woman. She was sent to Britain to a finishing school and study painting at the Slade School of Art. She was only 17, and she would have been by far one of the youngest artists in that context. The Slade School of Fine Art was a very important art school, probably one of the most important actually in the country. In 1954, there would have been a summer competition, and on that particular occasion, the topic set by the lecturer was to paint a scene after a radio play by Dylan Thomas, Under Milkwood. And that is something that Paula took on with much excitement, and rather than setting the scene of the play in a Welsh village, as it was the case, she transported it into a Portuguese kitchen. And that picture tells so much about how Paula always had to start from a very personal position to tell a story that she felt a deep connection with. And I think it's a wonderful representation of that moment of the intimacy within the secluded, protected space of the kitchen in which women share secrets and stories. That picture won the first prize. This lady is, of course, also important because that's where she met her husband, the painter Victor Willing, who she was incredibly in love with, and she went on to have 3 children with and live their life between Portugal and London.
The attitude of the time is that the women were not regarded as seriously as the male artists. However, she was lucky enough to meet Victor Willing, my father, and he believed in her work. And in another way, her husband gave her a deeper understanding of painting because he was an incredibly intelligent man, Victor Willing, who really understood painting.
There is a sort of turning point from 1960 with the picture of Salazar vomiting the homeland, when we see Paula completely changing the approach of making. She said that seeing Dubuffet work was a major turning point in her career.
And so when she saw Dubuffet, she went, I get it now. I can just do what I want. The only place where she could do anything was in painting. And that gave her immense release. And I think that's one of the very important aspects that carried her through all her career, was fighting repression through her work in one way or another.
As we move into room 2, we can see collages from the mid-60s. By this time, Paula had 3 children. She had been moving between Portugal and London. And in 1965, she had her first exhibition in Portugal. Around 1960, she began using collage, taking inspiration from different sources, everything from Greek pottery to cartoons, and then drawing these figures, cutting them up, and then building these collages, starting in a very intuitive manner, in a way enabling the image to form itself. The themes that she addresses in these wonderful collages from the mid-60s very much range from, again, the experience of the dictatorship to the condition of the workers in Portugal.
1966 was a difficult year for both Rego and her husband Victor Willing, because both their fathers died that year. And later on, Willing was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So this painting was inspired by a winter holiday that Rego, her husband, and her parents took in Alheiro, which is in northern Portugal. And she saw some firemen at a bar or a cafe, and they were barefoot in the snow, and they were wearing these very traditional coats, which are filled with straw. And it's surprised her to see how poor people were, and she knew it was linked to the government and the way things were ruled. Her work is obviously very personal and emotional. And you can tell when you look at the firemen of Alheiro, because it's not neat, it's not precise. Sometimes she cut it up, sometimes she tore it and then applied it on, and it's not very neatly glued on, because you can tell she's really going for it. She wants to share what she's feeling, and she wants to communicate something rather than produce a piece that comes up, in a bow.
The mid-70s, it's a time of a new exploration, a new journey for Paula. It is certainly a period when Paula begins exploring her psychic. She starts Jungian therapy, which is something that will have a huge influence in the following decade, and in a way very much influence her in exploring her own personal experience in her work. She received a grant from the Gulbenkian in Portugal to conduct an extensive research into folk tales across different countries, particularly studying in the British Library and the National Libraries of France and Portugal. This is connected to her interest in Jungian theories. There are narratives that holds archetypes about human behavior and very much investigates the sort of dark side of our existence. And these are the narratives that she was reading, translating at the time, and also ended up illustrating in a set of gouaches, 6 of which are on display in the exhibition. As we move into room 3, it's a completely new and different sets of visual experiences that open up for visitors. The room begins with 3 works, 3 paintings on paper from 1981. These belong of a series of The Red Monkey, which Paula executed incredibly rapidly, 1 work per day. This is the critical moment in which she begins investigating her personal experience through her pictures.
Paula felt that she could do anything to animals. If they're people, you have a different sense of judgment. So she anthropomorphized them as a way of letting her explore horrible things that wouldn't seem appropriate if they were real people. So the monkey becomes Vic. The bear becomes her lover, Rudy. And the dog in one ear sometimes is Rudy, sometimes it's her. And so she makes a series of autobiographical pictures where she tries to do what she can't do in her life, which is confront the fact that she's having an affair and being honest with her husband about it. And these are pictures done quite quickly, quite roughly, with enormous guts. When it comes out of her gut, it really has power and honesty. And when you see them in that third room, they're so together, they really tell that story.
The mid-80s is when these very rebellious girls start appearing in her pictures, beginning with the Vivian Girls series and then proceeding in later works, particularly the series of Dog and Girls pictures from 1986.
The girl and dog pictures are pictures where the girl is looking after the dog, shaving him, forcing open his jaws to give him medicine. And these are pictures about her looking after Vic, her husband, who is ill with multiple sclerosis and bedridden. The reality is, of course, that she never looked after Vic, but the feeling was there. But the dog isn't Vic. The dog is a Jungian symbol for loyalty and faithfulness. So what she's doing in these pictures is trying to get over her loyalty and faithfulness for Vic so that she can go off with her lover.
Room 4 includes 9 large-scale pictures which Paula completed between 1986 and 1988, and Paula exhibited at the Serpentine Gallery in London. It was an extraordinarily important moment for Paula, a moment in which very much her profile grew enormously, and she was recognized as this very prominent, important figure, both in Portugal and London. In this room, there are also 12 drawings, which I hope help explaining the process of the making of the painting. We see how Paula often started from an imaginative drawing, and then slowly she develops it into a more precise setting that relates to the painting. Here we very much see Paula channeling her unconscious, delving deep and exploring her desires, her fears, her imagination, and yet also exploring her adult feelings. The space acquires depth. We have shadows, we have that sense of projection in the interior. Each picture in a way is a story. There are these very intense and often erotic encounters between different figures. And certainly I think at that moment she was incredibly important in proposing a truly revolutionary way of representing women.
Dance is quite a heartbreaking picture, I think. It's a very personal work because she painted it over the course of 6 months, and her husband died before the completion of the painting. On the left you have Paula Rego, so a self-portrait of the artist, and then she's also represented on the right side of the painting, dancing with her husband Victor, who has just died. And then Victor is depicted a second time, this time in the middle, dancing with a blonde woman. And I think that's really a heartbreaking, sight. Her husband just died, and it's a really beautiful tribute to have him in the painting, and not only once, but twice. What's really interesting for our work is to know her process and how she paints, how she is in the studio. For example, for the dance, when we looked at it, there were just lots of holes over the surface, and they're not painted in. So when I looked into the paper record and looked at interviews that she had given to the newspapers, I found out that she liked to work on the floor or on the walls. And so she would pin the papers to the wall and then paint. That would explain why these holes are there and visible. And so we would not fill them and retouch them because they're part of the process of how, she painted it, their mark of the making of this painting.
she decided to make the dance about growing up as a girl and her life with Vic. And because Vic was in bed, unfortunately, he couldn't model for the picture, so she asked me, and at the time I looked very much like Vic. She got one of Vic's suits and his shoes. I put it on, I started modeling. And then Vic died. That summer, in June the 5th, he died. The grief was so palpable, I could see that she was distraught. And the only way she could deal with it was the way she's always dealt with everything, which is to fling herself into her work. She said, come on, Nick, we've got to carry on with the picture. Now, for me, it was one of the toughest summers of my life, really, modeling for that picture. At the end of it, for my birthday, she gave me a drawing she did of me posing as Vic. And I still have it on my wall. And every time I look at it, it looks exactly like me, but I only see my father. At the end of that picture, she draws this giant woman alone in Portuguese folk dress. And that's my mother on her own, defiant, independent, and able to face the world, now that Vic is gone.
In room 5, we begin with 6 works, part of the nursery rhymes etching. Paula started working a completely new series after the dance. Particularly, she had gone back to etching, something she studied at the Slade, but she abandoned over 2 decades. She produced this extraordinary series of etching, drawing directly on the plate and very much showing what an extraordinary drawer she is. Another aspect of this room is the extraordinary range of mediums that Paula is adapting. There is watercolor, oil paint, acrylic paint, and it's really extraordinary to see how much she mastered all of these mediums and how ambitious she was in terms of scale. In 1994, Paula was able to move to a much larger studio in Kentish Town, and this gave her a new opportunity to work on a much larger scale, producing very ambitious works such as The Barn or the cast of characters of Snow White. All her life, Paula enjoyed reading and thinking in terms of stories and characters. And this love for narratives and storytellings and the ideas of characters being a play materializes in all of her works. She's looking at cinema, another medium she loved since childhood, and we see Snow White, for example, or Pinocchio, which directly relate to the Disney films she saw as a child. Paula is able to replicate the incredible physicality and the darkness and the fantasy of the beautiful narratives. And yet there is also something important to clarify, and of which Paula has spoken, that in a way we don't need to have read these books or those stories in order to understand the pictures. Room 6 is dedicated to a very particular experience in the life of Paula when she was invited to be the first artist in residency at the National Gallery in 1990, and the work that emanates after that experience. When Paula was initially invited, she actually refused to take up the residency. She said the National Gallery is a museum dedicated to the work of male painters, male masters. I don't have much to do with that experience. Only a few weeks later, she called back the curator and said, actually, if that invitation is still open, I would very much like to take it up. And of course, Paula went on taking inspiration from artists that populate the National Galleries from across the centuries, from Crivelli to Velázquez to Hogarth, and yet inscribing them with her own imagination, with the stories of women.
One of my favorite
paintings in room 6 is Time Past and Present from 1990. This painting Paula did as one of the first paintings that she did when she was invited to the National Gallery. The first thing I find striking, or if you like, humorous about this painting, because in a way it makes me feel as if it mirrors her experience. So you have this little girl to the left who's just finding her way, sort of thinking how to draw or how to become an artist, possibly. Then there is this male character or protagonist in the middle, and we don't know whether he might be her grandfather, he might be her kind of tutor or something. But what I find very interesting is that she's the one who's active and he's the one who's passive, just looking at her. So it's a bit of a reversal of the usual role. It also mirrors her situation, if you like, at the National Gallery, in a sense that above her, if you look, you have all these references to the art history. And then the whole composition of the painting is, I think, based or inspired by Saint Jerome in his study. You have this perspective that allows you to look beyond it, so you are able to have a story within a story, and you have all these kind of different parts or sections of the image where lots of other kind of sub-stories are going on.
In 1994, she starts using pastel, and she starts representing a single figure in a quite bare setting. And this, of course, is the beginning of a very important series, The Dog Women, which is absolutely extraordinary, both in terms of execution and in terms of subject. We see these single figures. They are all sitting, lying, crouching on the ground. There's this sense that they are connected to their animal side. And so we very much think of these figures in terms of these very basic, simple needs and instincts.
Her late husband, Vic, he had died in 1988. And 6 years later, she thought that she could perhaps try and unpick their relationship, what that meant to her, how it made her feel, sometimes humiliated, sometimes grotesque, sometimes desperate, sometimes passionate. And all those things can sometimes come together in one picture. There's always two things, love and hate. There's loyalty and subversion. It's always the mixture of these opposing feelings that gives her life its truth and her pictures their authenticity.
Paula had begun again working with sitters in 1987, and this is the time when she started drawing family members, her children, but also Lila Nunes, who had come to London from Portugal primarily to assist her husband and helping in his everyday activity. Lila Nunes eventually becomes her most important model, particularly with the Dog Women series in 1994. Paula has described Lila not just as a model, but as a collaborator.
When she started working on pastel with the Dog Women, I was like there from the beginning, and it was like work, because it started, and for me it was like, oh my God, when is this going to stop? And, I had no idea I was going to be working with her for so long. And it just went on, Dog Woman after Dog Woman, drawing after drawing. And it was very intensive working on that. When I'm modeling and when she's working, I don't think, it's going to be me or it is related to me at all. Later on, I can identify, as a woman, I can identify with a lot that is in the paintings. Because they're not about me, They are about people, everyone. Everyone's life and stories.
The hugely important change in these works is in terms of medium, of course. Pastel is a medium that enables Paula to go back to a much more direct way of drawing. And she very quickly mastered this new medium, layering color after color, and then often scratching through with other pastels to show the different layers underneath, and producing these works of an extraordinary beautiful range of colors and playing with undertones and with darker and brighter colors. After the Dog Women series, Paula continues representing single female figure over a number of other very important pictures. And again, they are extraordinary in the way she explores different emotions, and it's impossible not to relate it again to her own personal experience. These are very specific, nuanced stories which speak of the complexities of relationship and the emotions and the frailty and often even the willingness to expose oneself and be vulnerable.
There's a room which has the abortion pictures. The first Portuguese referendum happened in 1998, and not enough people voted in order to change the law. There was a threshold that had to be met for constitutional laws of that kind to be overturned, and it wasn't met. And my mother was furious. She was furious because for years she had seen the suffering of backstreet abortions and how so many girls had died or been injured irreparably for the rest of their lives. And she set about making a series of pictures of young girls, some in school uniforms, after backstreet abortions. And they're pictures which show defiance and survival and their independence, but also pain. When they repeated the referendum in 2007, this time they showed those pictures at the Gulbenkian. The prints went round all over the country. They were in all the newspapers and magazines, and they made a difference. She says they're the most important things she's done. And one of the most powerful things about Paula Rego is that in Portugal, she has given permission for people to talk about the taboos that are still sometimes buried in the fascist past.
If you're looking for art that can make a difference in society, this certainly has done it on a big scale. You would wish or you would think that it would be fantastic if this body of work would be absolutely irrelevant to the current moment. That would be the position we, I suppose, want to be in. But unfortunately, the work is still hugely, hugely relevant and probably much more than we would want it to be. And it resonates in a sort of painful way, if you like.
When Paula was invited to display her work at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, she decided to tackle a very famous Portuguese novel by Eça de Queiroz from the late 19th century, titled The Crime of Padre Amaro. The priest called Padre Amaro abused his power and initiated this relationship with this very young woman, Amelia, who ends up becoming pregnant, and she's forced to have an abortion and dies giving birth. So these really dramatic stories, again, about the power of the patriarchy and the consequences of the type of social pressure and conditions for women. These are very important series of Paula. There is power struggles and difficult dynamics at play, but there is also an incredible sense of love and connections between these different figures, and Amelia, the mother, and the priest, and how do we address those and how do we make sense of those? And I think Paula's work is really extraordinary in giving a sense on this complexity of human relationships. As we move into room 9, we see a series of 7 pastels from a series titled Possession from 2004. They are works that were inspired by photographic documentations of women experiencing what was at the time defined as hysteria. They were taken by a neurologist called Jean-Martin Charcot. The work was conceived as a series of 7 pieces, and actually is very much Paula's desire to show them in a reasonably tight hang, so that effectively we experience them as one work rather than 7 individual elements. They are all set on the same couch that she had purchased from her own Jungian therapist. And the sitter is Lila Nunes. We see how she works through the formality of the composition and attempting to represent the incredible shiny quality of this velvet dress, and now the way in which she represents it changes over the 7 canvases using different backgrounds and different undertones. So in a way, it's an extraordinary work, both in terms of its formal qualities and the journey that went in the execution of the 7 pieces. And in a way, this series of works enables Paula to represent an experience of mental illness, which is also more broadly connected to women's experience of their own individuality and sexuality, and ultimately also her own personal journey. Moving into room 10, we have a series of very ambitious large pastels in which Paula explores, again, imaginative themes that in many ways returns to the setting of Portugal and to her memories of childhood in the country. Particularly, she goes back to memories of the war period, at a time when Portugal became a very important destination for refugees from across Europe, Portugal being a neutral country during the war.
Something, again, that keeps coming up in her pictures is her exploration of the feelings that she had as a young girl. There's perhaps one of her best ever pictures that she's painting. And the Pillar Man is initially inspired by a play by Martin Madonna. And she started painting a picture of the Pillar Man. And as she's working on it, she starts to realize that in reality, this picture isn't about Martin Madonna's play at all. It's about her childhood. There's something in the way she paints the picture that makes her feel very close to Portugal during the Second World War, and all those feelings of the beach and the people that were there and the exiles and that feeling of dread and of the end of the world. So it happens in every Paula Rego picture that it is started by somebody else's story, but it ends as a personal autobiographical story, and the attempt in the picture is to understand it better.
The last 2 rooms in the exhibition are dedicated to work produced since the early noughties. This is a time when Paula went back again making what she calls dollies. Those are puppets or characters which she intentionally creates as characters to stage in her works. Effectively, what she does is, often working with Lila or other collaborators, is creating a setting for the story she wants to tell, using props, using furniture, and inserting these characters alongside models who pose. And the two very much coexist together. Paula said that those non-human characters are very important because effectively they bring something uncanny and mysterious to the picture.
Those dollies, they become part of the story. You know, they are people. They are more than dollies. They're not just props. They're very important because they tell a part of the story, and they tell the story in a way that a person can't.
Room 11 is dedicated to 2 groups of works produced between 2007 and 2009. Human Cargo is a triptych. They are drawings with graphite and also crayon. This work relates to, again, news that Paula heard about the trafficking of women. And once more, it's a moment when Paula feels she wants to respond to this news. she reads and which cause so much sense of disbelief and rage. They're incredibly moving works. We see these women sitting down or lying against different parts of the setting that she created in the studio. There is this sense that those are stranded bodies and individuals who, in a way, feel trapped in these very particular situations. Alongside Human Cargo, we have 4 watercolors on etching and aquatine. This is something, again, Paula did throughout the decade since the 90s, a list of working and hand-coloring etchings. There are incredible images of children and women experiencing female genital mutilation. And this is, again, another event that Paula would have heard and read about and which she felt deeply affected. Of course, it relates back to much of the work she's done through her career, giving visibility to these experiences, to particularly the pain and abuse of women, and very much also exploring the very nuanced interconnection between victims and perpetrators. We have a mother who's both holding the daughter, enabling these operations to take place, and yet gazing at her so tenderly. And we have the same figures, this sort of monstrous woman, who in one of the series seems to be the person who performs the mutilation, but in another she's lying down on the table and she very much looks like the victim and someone who still in old age is experiencing the consequences of female genital mutilation. The series ends with Escape, a slightly smaller work in scale, and one of those in which I think Paula is giving an image of hope and a sort of new possibilities for the future. I hope this exhibition would very much make it obvious to everyone the incredible contributions that Paula has made to art. I think what remains important is that Paula is not giving us a lecture. Paula is speaking in a very nuanced way about the human experience, which is one which always retains many layers of complexities. She is speaking up for women, and she's doing so in a way that very much reflects personal experiences. And yet there is never a sense that there is a definitive answer or a very obvious way to define those experiences black and white. There is always nuance, there is always empathy, there is always understanding for the different parts and tensions that come into play in those relationships. And there is also a huge amount of humor and play, which I think is also important to remember when we look at those pictures.
The thing that I've learnt most from my mother's example is that if you do something very personal and true and small to you, it will become universally understood by others, and it will touch the hearts of millions. My mother would say, you can experience all life in your bedroom as a kid. You don't have to travel the world. It's right there. And I think that that's sort of part of her legacy, is that by mining her own experience, her complex and sophisticated and contradictory emotions, she has managed to hit on something that we can all understand. And it touches all of us. And because of that, it changes something. And I think, too, it's possible those who love her work, it changes them also. You know, she would say, I'm a coward, but in my work, I have the courage of a lion. I hope that her legacy is that other women will have the courage and the interest to explore their own passions. Because I think that what has happened is that she's managed to open the door for lots of other women to follow.